Senators, I'm no expert on climate change, but I do have a perspective on it as a result of my experiences and my research that I'm glad to share with you this morning. The opinions and conclusions I express are my own, and they do not represent the views of my former employer, the U.S. Army, or my current employer, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. After 25 years of active duty, I retired as a colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps in 2011 and returned home to Vermont. While I was on active duty, I had 2 tours in Alaska and 2 operational tours, one in Bosnia and one in Afghanistan. Each of these tours was important to me in developing my understanding of climate change. I was an assistant professor at the U.S. Army Commanding General Staff College and at West Point. As an adjunct at UVM now, I teach cyber policy and conflict, environmental politics, and environmental law. I have reviewed the resolution before you regarding climate change, and from my perspective on national security, I agree with it on all counts. Now, I do believe climate change in some form has been happening on this planet at some place in time, forever. But on the basis of the different studies and reports that I've read over time and my own experiences, I believe that human activities are contributing substantially to the changes that we're seeing in our environment related to climate and weather now. I say believe because I don't know for sure. But my time in the military taught me that you can't wait for a perfect operational picture of the situation before making a decision. The world is too complex a place to ever fully understand what is going on. It's non-linear and it's always changing in ways that are difficult to predict with certainty. So, you consider the facts that appear objectively reliable, identify those areas where your factual knowledge is weak, analyze what you think you know in a consistent manner, and then prepare for contingencies and emerging threats, particularly the threats that the threat trends suggest. And climate change is a threat trend that concerns me. The security agencies of the United States that are focused on external threats recognize climate change, whatever its causes, as an aspect of current and future security operations. Based on public domain information, including the very recent 2014 Department of Defense Quadrennial Review, the U.S. military is taking a 3-pronged approach to reduce the risk of potential climate change impacts upon military operations. First, and very appropriate given the enormous amount of fossil fuels DoD consumes each year, from a mitigation standpoint, DoD is investing in developing green energy sources. These efforts span the spectrum of research and operations, from developing algae-based biofuel for ships to testing solar panels for remote ground force locations to power computers. The development of alternative fuels is consistent with the green policy guidance given to the military by the administration, and the effect that such sources would have on reducing DoD's carbon footprint is often positively highlighted. Practically speaking, however, I doubt whether DoD would be engaging in these efforts unless there were also sound operational reasons for doing so, in addition to any mitigation benefits. For example, biofuels could reduce our dependence on countries that produce petroleum products, but whose politics are unpredictable or antagonistic. Tactical solar could reduce the number of casualties and equipment losses we sustain as we try to protect the fuel convoys that are necessary to power our generators. The second and third prongs are probably best seen from a resilience perspective. The second prong of DoD's efforts is to harden these installations to make them less susceptible to the effects of climate change, particularly extreme weather events. These changes could be fairly subtle, such as ensuring that roads in flood-prone exercise areas have larger diameter culvert pipes installed than might have been called for in years past using traditional engineering risk assessment factors. The third prong appears to be an increased recognition that both state and local authorities here at home and certain foreign allies will likely need better training and equipment to allow them to be able to cope with the effects of extreme weather events, effects likely exacerbated by climate change. Frankly, it is the assistance of foreign allies to help them prepare for disaster relief that concerns me the most from a national security perspective. Not because such training and equipment is bad. Unfortunately, it is likely to be used more often as climate change develops, and it would hopefully reduce the number of times that the United States is called upon to be the international first responder in the event of a disaster. Perhaps this reflects a considered judgment that climate change is inevitable, therefore choosing a course of action that deals with its results is a practical way forward. I don't know. But regardless, my concern is that treating extreme weather events occurring overseas as an operational fact, rather than developing doctrine and devoting resources to address climate change as an operational process that needs to be mitigated, reduces our chance for military success. To be blunt, it is probably not in the best interests of America today that people anywhere in the world decide to engage in armed conflict. The world's population has become increasingly interconnected through globalization and the internet and the growth of the megacity in the developing world. Today's wars amongst the people, as General Sir Rupert Smith has described them, are therefore different in many important respects from the rural-centered insurgencies conducted by Mao and Jiang back in the 20th century in developing countries. Developed countries will not be immune to the effects of climate change, but we are better resourced to be able to respond to its challenges. In the developing countries, however, those human and material resources often do not exist. Further, these countries generally have expanding populations, despite little growth in their arable land, and in many cases are experiencing rapid urbanization as rural populations move away from the countryside to the city to seek greater opportunities. These new city dwellers often occupy very marginal real estate, such as swampy coastal areas that are prone to flooding. Climate change could lead to food and water shortages because of drought, deforestation, and conflict over farmland and water resources. Disease could spread beyond its normal geographic or temporal ranges as the climate changes. All of these factors would likely lend themselves to reduced political and economic stability in these more vulnerable countries. I don't know that there's any empirical evidence that climate change itself results in armed conflict, but I strongly suspect it is, or at least will be, an important aggravating factor. Senators, there's another level of understanding climate change that we must confront in order to promote stability in developing countries. Different organizations and nations have begun to recognize that there is a gender component to stability issues. Generally speaking, women and girls are impacted differently and more severely than men and even boys as a result of armed conflict. They tend to be more likely to suffer sexual violence and less able to adapt to life as refugees and displaced persons because they're ordinarily the primary family caregivers. Further, they're less likely to be educated or to have marketable skills that can allow them to make a living and generate hard cash. Not surprisingly, women in these countries tend to experience the effects of climate change differently and more severely than men for similar reasons. They have fewer economic opportunities to earn money that could be used for climate change mitigation and resilience investments. They fail to receive educations because their time is consumed with locating ever more scarce biofuel and water resources for their family's domestic use. They possess fewer economic assets such as bank accounts, land and water rights, and frankly they tend to be politically and socially marginalized in those societies. If resource scarcity amplifies the negative effects of armed conflict, then women and girls in these societies will likely endure a perfect storm of gender-differentiated suffering when war and climate change collide. This is more than just discriminatory. This is a direct threat to our interests. America works to promote international stability because that leads to the rule of law and hopefully greater democracy and freer markets, which all benefit our well-being in the long run. The gender-differentiated aspects of climate change that I just described undercut these efforts. Effectively dealing with climate change from a national security perspective is therefore much more than a question of green fuel for warships or wider pipes under roadbeds. It is also necessary that we recognize climate change as a process that is likely to challenge our values and our bedrock beliefs and our ability to foster greater security and equity among the different nations and populations with whom we are increasingly engaged. So what does this mean for Vermont? Well, as you know better than anyone, Vermont National Guard not so long ago spent a year in Afghanistan. The Vermont National Guard has Senegal, West African country, as its partner in the partnership program that links up different National Guard units from different states to developing countries. Afghanistan is an area already impacted by climate change, and our chances of building stability there are markedly decreased because of what we have to go through to try to build stability in an area victimized by deforestation, desertification, and the same is true of Senegal. So it's not just a question of this being a global defense issue. Quite frankly, it comes home here to Vermont as well. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And again, I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning.
Thank you very much for, I'd say, opening my eyes to a broader discussion than we don't generally have in the building when we're talking about climate issues. Are there any questions from members of the committee?
I have a question.
Senator Rogers.
I might have a question for everybody if you keep offering.
Sir,
It was very interesting testimony, and when you talk about resource scarcity, one of the things that I find that isn't being discussed is the overpopulation of this rock. And in my mind, one of the things that's driving all of the problems from resource scarcity to climate change is that we've allowed in this world the population to grow beyond possibly what it should be, and now we're growing crops in places that we shouldn't be growing crops, so we're pumping aquifers dry to grow those crops to try to feed the huge number of people on the planet. Why isn't there more discussion of overpopulation?
Forgive me, Senator, the discussion by whom?
Well, it doesn't seem that when we're talking about any of these problems that anybody, whether it's the federal government, the Department of Defense, the environmental groups, nobody seems to be talking about the impact of having so many people on the planet today.
Is it clearly a problem in terms of resource scarcity? There's no doubt that all overpopulation is having an impact. Just from what I read in the media, I mean, there are definitely efforts to promote family planning and things of that nature in different countries. But this becomes a very complex and emotional issue. I'm thinking of a debate I had last year with a social worker from a Catholic charity as we were discussing the impact of the one-child policy in China. This is something very important, but very difficult to generalize and to move forward.
Maybe that's why nobody's talking about it, because it's a hard subject to talk about.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Senator Campion.
Thank you, Colonel. Very, very helpful testimony. And I know I've done some reading that has talked about the military really being a leader on issues related to climate change, particularly around the issues that you talked about. And I'm wondering, how long has the military been concerned about this issue and working to address it from a national and sort of global security problem? Do you have any idea of when it sort of first came to light for the military?
Forever. The military is always concerned about climate and weather. Part of the standard preparation of any battlefield, one of the first things any commander looks at is what the climate and weather is. Is there going to be fog? Are there rivers going to be running too high so I can't forward my trucks or troops across them? Weather has always been one of the most important parts of military preparation. Recognizing that weather is variable and that there are trends as far as, okay, so I graduated from UVM in 1983 as an ROTC cadet. Even at that point, even in basic cadet education, all we did was talk about weather and changing weather.
Yeah. But what you shared with us, I think, is quite different in that, perhaps I'm wrong, that the trends and the things that are happening right now, the military is talking about articles. I know I've talked, over and over again, talk about military preparedness as it relates to helping countries that are the most vulnerable. You talked about a number in a way that is much different, I think, than just general weather patterns. And I'm wondering when this, at this level, became really at the forefront of military policy.
From my perspective, you have to remember I was a judge advocate.
Yeah.
So I spent most of my time working on legal issues. However, teaching at the Command and General Staff College started in 2000. At that point in time, this was already something we were considering in our curriculum. So at least as early as 2000, from an educational perspective, and from a consideration of what might be necessary to change doctrine, these issues were already being discussed by the senior captains and the young majors who make up the student body at the college.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would invite